Welcome to the Workbench. I am Nancy Solomon, Chair of HERMAB's Labour Committee, and joining me today is Josephine Woods. Josephine is currently pursuing her Master's in Labour and Employment Relations at UWI, and she'll be joining me today as we delve into two concepts that are often confused: contracts of service and contracts for service. So, one of the most important things we need to do is to understand the importance of this distinction for employees and for employees. So, Josephine, can you tell me a bit about contracts of service?
Thanks for having me on the workbench today, Nancy. And I would like to say that the type of contract you sign is very important. Employees need to pay close attention because it determines whether you qualify as an employee with full rights and protection as opposed to an independent contractor with no statutory benefits. So, in essence, contract of service describes the employer and employee relationship. The relationship is governed by specific guidelines such as rules and regulations. For example, is the employee subject to the organizational rules and policies? Does the employee's service is it exclusive to the organization? Does the employer make statutory deductions on behalf of the employee? And the key elements to consider when determining whether a contract of service exists is the level of control. The employer has significant control over the work and working hours. The employer decides the how, when, and where the work is done. The risk and responsibility is another element to consider because the employer assumes all the risk and responsibility versus an independent contractor who bears all the risks. For example, the employer is responsible for the statutory deductions, such as making contributions to the National Insurance Scheme, in Barbados context, the NAS. Another element to consider is whether the employee's benefits, such as vacation, paid vacation leave, maternity and paternity leave, and severance pay, elements that protect the employee and the employer.
Okay, Josephine, so I can see the difference already because the contracts for service now, on the other hand, that is where the individual is an independent contractor and they basically set their own rules and their own restrictions. All of the responsibility, all of the burdens is bared by that independent contractor. So they have to pay their own NIS, their own PAYE. They don't have any of the benefits you spoke about earlier because there's no one, they are working for themselves and providing that service to the company or the individual. But on the flip side now, when you mentioned about the level of control and the hours of work and the rules that an employee who is under a contract of service will be bound by, the contract for service, that independent contractor, they generally set their own terms as relates to that. While yes, they do have a specific time to probably complete certain projects. If they're, let's say, maybe in like IT and, construction, because somebody may come in to build your house, they give them a contract. They or you all are into a contract for service to build that property. They have a timeline. How they do the different parts, there'll be some degree of structure, but there's still a lot of autonomy in their work. So I can see the distinctions in between the contracts of service and the contracts for service, as you were speaking.
Yes, Nancy, I would agree with you. Autonomy is an important element to consider, but one thing employers must pay close attention to is the working relationship between the employer and the employee. And we see this coming out in the Uber case that happened a few years ago in the UK, where the Uber drivers were treated as independent workers. But the drivers challenged this because in the Uber case, it came out that Uber, in essence, had control over how they work. They Uber controlled the app, the fares, the route, the terms of service. They would deactivate drivers due to poor ratings. And the drivers relied heavily on Uber for work. And they were not allowed to build their own customer base. And you saw this come out a lot in the Uber case. The drivers were in a position of subordination. Uber, in essence, controlled everything. So you see, when you look at the Uber case from 4 years ago, the results that the workers were not independent contractors, they were workers, they were employees who were entitled to the same benefits mentioned earlier: paid annual leave, national minimum wage, and protection from unfair dismissal.
That is very, very interesting, Josephine. I would have never thought that an Uber driver could be considered an employee because the concept of Uber is that each person, you have your own car, and you just get a call. Yes, you registered under this app or this umbrella organization, but basically I would definitely would have considered them as a freelance or freelancers. They're just picking up a job at a point in time if they get a message. So it is interesting that it is not just, as you said, it's not just enough to say you are an independent contractor and therefore I don't owe you anything, I don't owe you any benefits, I don't owe you any coverage, any provision. So employers definitely, that's a really good point you made there. We definitely need to be careful that they go beyond simply stating it in the contract, but ensuring that the working relationship really leaves and ensures that independent aspect of it is maintained so that they are not being too fixed with the person's time and their hours and those things you highlighted. Josephine, this contract of service and contracts for service is a really, really funny area because you can have gray areas that can really be, I mean, the Uber case is a good example, but locally we had a case in 2007 with Sagicor and their insurance agents, and the agents basically were stating that they were in fact employees and not freelance workers. And a lot of persons would have told themselves, well, how could that be? Because an insurance agent, you get commission from your policies, and that's how you make your money. You don't really have like a fixed time of work. They're on the road. They tend to set their own hours. They work weekends, evenings, nights. But the court actually found that in fact these employees were deemed to be workers because the court looked at three tests in that case. The control test, similarly to what you spoke about with Uber, they looked at the degree of control an employer had over the individual's work. So they still had to bring in a certain number of policies each quarter, and they had certain expectations. They had targets to meet. They looked at the integration test, looking at how deeply that worker was integrated into an employer's business. From the time you hear Sagicor, you think insurance, and then the next concept is insurance agents. So they were integral into what they do. There can be no Sagicor without Sagicor insurance agents or insurance agents on the whole. And then they looked at the economic reality test, which considered the full context of the working arrangement and the overall reality of that relationship. So the court actually found in favor of the workers in that case again, right? They recognized that the workers were too integrated into Sagicor's business to be deemed as freelancers, but they were in fact employees. And that was a big, big judgment here in Barbados. So we really, really need to understand the differentiation between a contract of service and a contract for of service and a contract for service, because it really is not as simple as writing it down on a piece of paper and and telling an employee, or rather a worker, that this is your contractual obligation. Because in fact, as you indicated earlier, the working relationship is what it comes down to.
Yes, Nancy, I can agree with you that employers need to pay attention to the wording of their contracts, but don't let us forget there are benefits to contract for services. The employer, there's cost savings. In addition to a wider pool of access in terms of talent, such as plumbers, whether IT consultant, and then for the independent contractor, there's flexibility. They decide, they set the time, the how, and the when. There's more freedom, which gives them more time for family. And that is something that is very important as well. It also allows the independent contractor to avoid a pool, for access to build their client base and to have greater control over their work and earning potential.
Okay, so if I'm understanding you correct, then that will really fit into now this wave that we're having following COVID, where employees now want, this flexibility, this hybrid work. So there's a concept that I believe is a new term, is the gig worker.
Yes, the gig worker. The gig worker engage more on their contract for services because they're looking for more flexibility. These are people that are looking for quick money, quick access to clear the bills and to take care of their family. And we see this for the taxi drivers, just a quick example, painters. So, well, there's no guarantee hours and there's more independent status. There is more control for them to build their brand, for them to build their client base, for them to have a wider access in terms of who gets their services and generating their revenue.
Okay, Josephine, definitely we are seeing a trend in this economy, in this new age, to that type of work. So I guess the contract for service could possibly even one day even replace the concept of the contract of service, because more persons are going to have that desire, like you said, to build up their family life, keep that flexibility and have their options open. So even while saying all of that, it's clear that the line is very gray in some aspects, because you can have an employer doing duties that would normally fall under an employment relationship. But if they are classified as an independent contractor, they may be in fact entitled to benefits and protection. So you could see there could be some legal complications coming out. So the best thing to do for both the employer and for the worker is to seek legal advice. Ensure your correct classifications to avoid any tax complications or any legal issues. Make sure and check to see which category of relationship is actually existing in between the two parties. That is always going to be the best advice, because to do otherwise, you could find yourself later on in a legal battle.
Let's not forget, Nancy, that the key difference in both of these different two terms, two contracts, lies in the level of control, the tax obligations, and the benefits. These three key differences will save an employer a lot of money.
That is all for today. Thank you very much, Josephine, for joining us on the Workbench as we break down workplace issues and build up insights. Join us again next fortnight as we tackle another area of interest on the employment landscape.